Hey, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Today's topic is best practices for an IBM security administrator. The presenter for today is Carol Woodbury. She is a CISSP, a CRISC, a PCIP. That's just a lot of letters. That means she knows a lot about security. She's the VP of Global Services and Technical Lead here at Help Systems. My name is John Vanderwell. I'm the VP and Business Unit Manager for Global Security Services for the IBM, and we are your hosts, and Carol is your presenter for today. So with that, I'm going to actually turn it over to Carol and let her start addressing this topic. So take it away, Carol.
Thanks, John, and thanks for joining us today. The reason that we are talking about this is because all of you as administrators are so busy. You really have no clue where to start a lot of times, but you know that you need to do something. And truth be told, if security is not administered, things typically, I say undone, they kind of slide away from where you want them to be. So it may be a very fast out of compliance, but it's usually just over time things kind of degrade. So I decided that since you're so busy and I kind of live in this world, maybe I can give you a checklist for what needs to be done, and that might help you actually get some things accomplished. So here's your task list. All right, the first thing, and I realize that security policy is not your primary responsibility, or likely it's not. But what I would encourage you to do is when the opportunity arises for you to review the security policy, make sure that you take that opportunity and make sure that the things reflected in that policy reflect what is going on IBM I. A lot of times people who are writing these policies may not be aware of all of the data or type of data that is residing on the systems that we administer. And so they may need to adjust that policy to address some of that data. So we just reviewed our policies here at Help Systems, and there were some things that I was able to point out that they did not realize. And so I think the same thing might be with you. So make sure you are the best aware of what is actually running on the system. So make sure that your policy reflects that. All right, so on to system values. So the checklist for system values, a lot of people will ask me, where do I get best practices settings for system values? So there's several places that you can get that. One is the IBM Security Reference Manual. Another is my book. If you happen to have that, there's a whole chapter on system values. The other is if you run our risk assessor product. So if you're one of our MSS, Managed Security Services clients, you get an annual risk assessment. In that risk assessor output, you have the best practices settings for the security relevant system values. So that's where you can get those best practices settings. So what you then have to do is take those recommendations, evaluate it against what your current settings are, and decide whether or not they should be changed. Now, in changing some of those, you want to make sure that you consider things before you change them to make sure you're not going to break something. So I just had a question about QCreate this morning from Scott Forsty at IBM. And so he said, what's your recommendation for best practices? And it wasn't just change it from change to use or exclude. I had to explain there's some things you have to consider before you just outright change QCreate so you make sure that things don't break. So make sure that you understand the system value, understand where you want to get, and make sure that you consider things that are going to break prior to changing them. So the other key system values, and we'll go into some other more detail, is QSecurity, the password system values, QMAX sign, the audit system values, QCreate again, and QSSL system values. Let's look at these in a little bit more detail. So QSecurity, if you know anything about me, you know that I insist that systems have to be running at security level 40 or 50 to have any guarantee of security at all. At the lower system values, security is not assured. You can bypass it. And so you must be running at security level 40 or 50 to have operating system and data integrity. If you need to be able to move between from a lower security level to a higher security level, there are still a number of systems that are not at 40 or 50. If you're one of those, you can either read the Security Reference Manual, Chapter 2. We also can help you from that as a services engagement. Now for auditing. So the on-off switch for auditing is a Q audit control system value, and the Q audit level determines which actions are going to be audited. So this is our minimum recommended setting for Q audit level. Now, many of you may have more, and honestly, the more the better, because then that information is available if you need to use it to debug something or to determine how a user profile is being used, or to determine if your system has been breached. But this is the minimum level that we would recommend. Now, some auditors require that you do extra auditing for users that have a command line, or possibly for those users that have all object special authority. Some even require it for SecAdmin. So to do that, you would use the change user aud command to turn on additional auditing that will log all of the commands that those users enter from a command line. If you need to know when a profile is used and it's not already included in the system value, then you can turn on additional auditing at the user level, again using the change user audit command, and add that job basic action auditing. That will log whenever that user logs on, whenever they start, stop, release, or hold a job. Now, from an administrator point of view, one of the things that you need to pay attention to is how your journal receivers are saved. And a lot of this has to do with your policy settings on how long you need to have that information around. So a lot of that, again, will depend on which country you're in, which laws and regulations you must be under. For example, if you have to be in compliance with the payment card industry data security standards, you have to have that audit information around for at least a year. Now, that doesn't mean you have to have it on your system for a year, but you have to have it available. So what I've found is that a lot of administrators don't necessarily have a contiguous set of journal receivers for a full calendar year or for a full 12 months. They may have partial months, depending on how the journal receivers are saved, or they may have 3 months if they're doing like a media rotation through their full system saves. But what you really want to do, especially if you are ever called upon to investigate a breach, you want to be able to easily bring back those journal receivers. So say somebody came to you and said, we need to determine if something was breached for December 1st through the 15th. Would you be able to do that? So that's the question that you have to ask. And a lot of people have had to rework how they save their journal receivers. So as an administrator, that's what I would recommend that you do, and make sure that you are paying attention to how those journal receivers are saved. Okay, moving along to the password level. What we're seeing is a lot more organizations are requiring stronger passwords. So we see a lot more organizations moving to password level 2 or 3. These are the ones that enable the passphrases of up to 128 characters. You do not have to require users to enter that long of a password, but you can enable that. It also enables upper and lowercase passwords and any special character and punctuation. If you can type it in, it can be your password. So that's level 2 or 3. But at a very minimum, what we would recommend is that you are running at either password level 1, which is still that maximum of 10 characters, or if you're going to the longer password, we recommend that you bump up to level 3. And that's because at 0 and 2, this very weakly hashed algorithm is stored. And that weakly hashed algorithm was used in the past by old clients, Windows 95, 98 ME, or Windows 2000 Server. Hopefully none of you have those clients in your network anymore. And even if you do, they have to be connecting to a file share to have that password be used. So if you're not connecting to file shares, or you're not connecting with one of these old clients, it's safe to move up to this higher level and get rid of that weakly and very vulnerable hash. Now, I talked in detail about moving to a higher password level in another Coffee with Carol. And so I've put the link there so that you can go and watch that if you need to. So the other thing along the lines of passwords is which system value you're going to use to define what your password rules are. So this is the minimum length, maximum length, what it requires a digit, and so forth. I would really encourage you to move away from the individual system values and put all your rules in the password rules system value, because it has so many more options for you. And using this system value typically allows you to align more with your network requirements than just using the individual ones. And so I would highly recommend that you move off of the individual ones to using the password rules. Or you can consider getting rid of passwords altogether. So we are seeing a great increase in using SSL, single sign-on, recently. And so again, we have a webinar that we've done on that. But basically that allows you to set the passwords to *none, because rather than using user IDs and passwords, the authentication actually comes in via Kerberos. And that does not include or use a password in any way, shape, or form. So for the vast majority of your profiles, you can actually set the password to *none. So that's another thing that you can do to consider as an administrator to actually get rid of passwords. Now, another set of system values that have started to become more important in recent years are the system values that control the strength of the encryption on your system. So this is the encryption that is used when data is in motion. So this is the encrypting your telnet sessions, for example, or your ODBC sessions. So these system values will control whether you're using a weak protocol known to be vulnerable or a strong one. So again, from laws and regulations, again, I'll use PCI DSS, probably because I'm just recertifying for my PCIP. So I've had to reread the PCI DSS. But from a PCI perspective, it's requiring that you only use TLS 1.2 or higher. And the reason is because the other protocols, the TLS 1.1, 1.0, and all of the SSL protocols are quite old and quite vulnerable. There's been a number of vulnerabilities that have been exposed. So from a best practice, you want to get to the point of being able to use only TLS v1.2. If you're running version 7.4 of the operating system, you also have the opportunity to run TLS version 1.3. So you can see these are the protocols by release. This is one reason, again, to stay current from an operating system point of view, because you can see that TLS 1.2 only came available in version 7.1 with technology release 6. So again, staying current is, again, something from a system administrator point of view that you want to endeavor to do. So before you just go ahead and change the system value, again, this is one of those that can break things. So you want to do some research before you just set it. So there are some PTFs that allow you to determine If you have any connections that are using the weaker protocols, you'll need to work with those connections to make sure that they can handle the higher protocols, but find out before you just blindly set that system value. So I've given you a link to a couple service bulletins from IBM to do that research. I've also done a couple Coffee with Carols on the topic, so again, here's the links to those so you can do more research prior to changing those system values. Okay, enough with the user profile, the system values. Let's go into user profiles. So what I find is that a lot of administrators will create the user profiles, but then they just stay as is forever. And the problem is they are never reviewed. And I say stay as is, but what happens is that you'll get the request, someone moves jobs. So you get the request to add them to a different group profile, but you never get the request to remove them out of the old one. And so what happens is that people get multiple groups, and some of those groups they shouldn't be in anymore because it allows access to data for which they no longer have a job responsibility. So I'm listing the commands here that you can use to list out the user profiles. So display user profile, name the group profile. The type here is group member. That lists all the members of that group profile. Or there's a command that prints all of the user profiles in the system. If you do it by sequence of group profile, lists the group and all of the members. We have had clients have audit findings because they are not regularly reviewing the group membership. So my recommendation for reviewing those is quarterly. The other thing that needs to be reviewed regularly is special authorities. And why do I say review this? Well, I've seen time and time again where programmers will get assigned all objects for a special project that they're working on, or again, maybe they're added to a specific group for a project that they're working in. And if you don't review it, they're never removed. So for special authorities, what I would encourage you to do is to have a template that for each type of user profile, each role, where that template profile only has the special authorities that they're needed to do their job. And then review the special authorities again quarterly. So you can do that using the print user profile command. You can also do this again using display user profile *alt1 file. That's probably how most people do it. But I would like to point out that there is a view in QSys2 that brings back all of the user information just like the out file did. And it's so much easier. You don't have to remember to do the out file and refresh it to get the most current data. If you're using the information out of that view, it's instantaneously current when you create or delete or change a user profile. So if we're doing anything with user profiles, this is how I get the information out. The other thing that you'll want to review on a regular basis is the limited capability setting. So most users on your system should be limited capability yes. That means if they can get to a command line, they can only run selected commands. So as the system ships, it's like 6 commands: sign off, display message, display job, and so forth. All right. So one thing that I find that a lot of people will do is misuse IBM supplied profiles. So there are actually quite a few profiles that get shipped with IBM I, but these are the ones that tend to be, I'll call it, misused. So let's go through these. QSec offer is one of those profiles that should only be used when a system is being upgraded or when a vendor has been lazy and has demanded that you sign on as QSec offer. It should not be used for daily work. And the reason I say that is because if you are using it for daily work, it's really difficult to discern when it's being misused, when it's been hacked, when somebody else has gained access to that profile and is misusing it. The other thing is that that profile has more authorities than literally any other profile on the system. And so you do not need to be running with those capabilities. The better thing to do is to create your own group profile that has all the special authorities and create yourself as a member of that group. Don't be a member of CUSEC Offer. Don't run as CUSEC Offer. All right. Now, the way that you can protect CUSEC Offer from being abused is that you can set it to status of disabled. So you can always sign on to the console, even if that profile is disabled. Obviously, you need to know the correct password, but you can protect it from being misused by setting it to password of disabled. Now, QProgrammer is the next one that I see being abused, and that's because a lot of people have either made it a group profile for their developers, and or a lot of vendors have chosen to use QProgrammer as the owner of their utility. So by making programmers a member of that group, if you have one of those utilities or programs on the system that is owned by QProgrammer, guess what? All of your programmers own it as well. In addition, IBM ships many commands authorized to QProgrammer. So QProgrammer and therefore your developers have access to many commands that really, in my opinion, don't belong in the programmer role. So again, I would prefer to make a different profile, a group profile for your developers, and leave them out of QProgrammer. In addition, it should not have a password. It should be set to star none, because that's how it ships. CUSEC Offer is authorized to pretty much the right commands from a role-based access. So if you want to make that your operator's group profile, that's probably okay. But again, should not be used for sign-on. It ships as star none, and we recommend that you leave it that way. QServe, QServe base are going to be used by IBM or whoever services your hardware. Again, it will need a password when they are on site to do that, but that should not need a password any other time. QUser, again, should not be used for sign-on or as a group. Should be password as star none, but it cannot be set to disabled as it breaks several things around the system. So we've talked about powerful profiles and the need to audit those. So what we recommend is for those profiles that need additional auditing, like CUSEC Offer, that you add command and job-based auditing on those individual profiles. And again, the way that you do that is using this command string I've listed in this chart, change user aud. One of my pet peeves is profiles on the system that are inactive and remain on the system. If they remain on the system, they should at least be set to disabled if they're not in use. Now, there's something right on the system. There's sec tools, and that allows you to set these profiles to be disabled, and the system will automatically do that for you. So what you can do is choose a time frame. Many people choose 90 days. So after 90 days, if the profile hasn't been used, you can set it to, the system will automatically set it to status of disabled. So that's right in the system. It's a tool that you can use. At least you want to use that. If not, then take them off the system once they've been not used for a period of time. I often hear, I can't get rid of this profile. And it's because it owns so many things or it has a lot of jobs being scheduled. So a couple things that you want to be aware of. People come back. I've listed a news article here because it talks about an IT person that was convicted because they had a profile that was still on the system after they left the organization, and he hacked back in and did harm. So it happens. So what I recommend is that you have your administrators, you all, be a member of a group, and you give your own objects over to that group. So when you're creating device descriptions and message queues and out queues, they're not owned by you personally, but they're owned by your group profile. And then rather than running job schedule entries as yourself, you run them as a service account. So, this is a polite way to let your profile be removed from the system when you're no longer with the organization. The other thing that we have to do regarding managing profiles is passwords. So of course, it's never a good idea to have a default password. So there's a command that you can run, analyze default password, which will list out any profiles that have a default password. That's something that you would want to do regularly. And you want to manage those profiles that have never changing passwords. So again, you can look at the password expiration interval attribute, again, in the view in QSys2. And this applies to you that I'm talking to as well, because as an administrator, you have one of the most powerful profiles on the system. So you should be changing your passwords regularly. Because you can go in and modify your profile to set it to your password to never expire. Just because you have the ability to do that doesn't mean you should. I've talked to many of an administrator on our risk assessment. When we do a risk assessment for people, we have a follow-up call to go over the results. And it's kind of embarrassing when I'm pointing to the report that lists out the profiles with non-expiring passwords. And the profile on the system is clearly the person I'm talking to and their managers in the room. So again, just because you can change your profile to have a never expiring password, that is certainly not best practice. So I've mentioned service accounts a couple times. People will call them a variety of names, but these are the profiles that are used. They don't represent a person as much as they represent a task that needs to be done. So either it's a profile that is making an ODBC connection to or from a Windows server, or a JDBC connection to WebSphere, or maybe it's the service account that runs all your job schedule jobs, whatever it is. It's something that you want to make sure of doesn't have any more authority than what they should have. So I've listed the attributes here that you'll want to create the profile with. And of special note is a special authority of none. I would highly recommend that you not default this to all object. And with the authority collection feature that came in V7R3 and enhanced in V7R4, you do not have to by default give service accounts all object anymore. You can find out the authority they need, grant that authority, and eliminate having to give service accounts all object. So I encourage you to investigate that feature. The other one is group profiles and ownership accounts. Again, in this case, the difference between this and the service accounts, often service accounts, especially if they're making a connection, have to have a password. Now, for sure, make sure that that password is not a default password. And I see that happening. I mention this because I see this happening. And the way it happens is that development starts working with a new technology, and they're making a connection, and they need a service account, and it gets created with a default password, and then it's never changed, and it's moved to QA, and it still has a default password. And then guess what? They don't want to change it at this point because they know it works, so they move it into production with a default password. So from the beginning, don't let it have a default password. Okay, so group profiles are really not meant to be used for sign-on. So in this case, you can set the group profile to be password of *none. All right, so profile cleanup hints. If a password is *none, then set the password expiration interval to sysval, not nomax. This gets it off the reports of profiles with non-expiring passwords. It doesn't have a password, so the system is not going to look at the expiration interval. All right. If a profile is used for batch processing, it doesn't need to be status of disabled or enabled. You can actually set that to be disabled. And again, protect that even one more layer. Also, I think a lot of people are afraid to delete profiles because they think they're going to like orphan things. So you cannot delete a profile that owns objects. So you're not going to orphan objects or let them not have an owner. That can't happen. And the other thing is that you can't delete a group profile that has members. So, don't worry about orphaning either objects or group members. All right, on to data. All right, so one of the things as an administrator, again, you probably are in the unique position of understanding the value of the data to your organization. And you understand what can happen when that data isn't available or somebody accidentally updates it. They run a select or an update statement and maybe they ran it against the wrong database and it was successful because they had too much authority. You know what it is if for some reason somebody downloads a spreadsheet and then uploads it and with the wrong data. So you know that business disruption, and you're probably in the unique position to know that. So you know what happens when the system is down, and there's probably a hard value figure to that. So you have to determine, along with your management, how many layers of defense you're going to put in place to be able to reduce the risk of that business disruption to an acceptable level. So one thing that people are focused on is the confidentiality of the data and the privacy of the data. Throughout Europe, there's GDPR, so privacy is a big thing, and being able to know where that data is. In the United States, we're starting to see more focus on that with a law in California, CCPA, which again starts to focus on privacy. So there's a lot of focus on privacy and personally identifiable information, the social security number, the social insurance number, or bank accounts and that type of thing. The problem is there is information that in each organization that makes you uniquely you that is often ignored. It's not PII data. It may not be in the general security sense confidential, but it's confidential to your organization. And the value of that data being missing or not available or not accurate is often ignored. Again, you are in a unique position to help determine what that value is and to communicate that both back to the business as well as to management. So with the multiple layers of defense, yes, there's menu, I'll put in quotes, security, that you lock your end users into a menu. But we don't live in that world anymore. We live in a world of multi-connections and multi-ways to access the system. So we have to determine how we're going to secure that data. For data integrity, the most public authority can be is public use. For confidentiality, it has to be public exclude and only authorized to those users that need that information. So implementing object level security will protect that data from unauthorized access. One of the techniques we use when we help people reorganize their security is to use authorization lists. It is a handy way, especially when you need one person needing authority to multiple database files. So again, that's one of those things that needs to be reviewed on a regular basis. When you put an authorization list in place, we're always very careful to only authorize the users that need access to those files, to those lists. But again, what I see happening, just like the addition of group profiles or special authorities, I see people authorized to authorization lists over time that don't really need access. And the case where I see it is typically in the debug case. Something has happened on production. A developer needs to have access to be able to debug a production situation and never removed. That or security is always blamed for a problem. And so I often see an authorization list that had been public exclude move to public star all because, of course, when a production failure happens, it's security's fault. So in that case, again, when they figure out it really wasn't security, they fail to put that authorization list back to exclude. So unless you review these settings on a regular basis, again, quarterly, it's not going to ever be caught. So again, there's a view that you can use to list out the users authorized to an authorization list. The other thing you might want to do is review the objects secured by the list. And again, there's another view for that. And I would highly recommend using the view over the display authorization list object command, because that command can take a long time to run and the view is much faster. Adopted authority has gotten a bad name. People say you shouldn't use adopted authority, but it is actually a tool that we use extensively, and it is very powerful as long as it's used wisely. So from an administrator point of view, you will want to put in a practice of reviewing all the new programs that come onto the system that adopt an all object profile. So again, it would be very difficult to go backwards in time to review those. And so I understand that, but what you can do is put a stake in the ground and starting today, start finding new profiles that come onto the system or are changed to have an owner that adopts programs that adopt an all object profile. A little tongue-tied this morning. All right, the other thing that we find from a data perspective is DDM. And DDM is a very easy way to talk between IBM I systems, but it can expose your data quite easily. And that's because if the DDM connection does not require a password, then it's quite easy for me as a non-administrator profile to use this thing called add server authentication entry and say, I want to start out as Carol on my system, but on any target system that uses DDM, I'm going to run as QSecOffer. So I can then run remote commands and gather data back and find that data. It's one of the tests that we use in our penetration testing. It's actually one of the most fun ones to use because people are like, you got that data as a non-admin user? Wow. So it's very easy to exploit. And so it's one of those things that you want to look into. Again, it's not something that you can just turn on and change the attribute of your DDM server to require a password. Most of the things I've talked about are going to require a bit of consideration so that you don't break something. Now, I want to point out one thing. This is one of those areas where if you are using exit point software, and whether you're using help systems or somebody else's, DDM, a lot of people will only use those products and use it for logging. But DDM is one of those areas that you can easily start to put rules in place, because while DDM is widely used in some organizations, most organizations only use it for things like BRMS or just a couple different connections between systems. So it's easy to look at those logs. You're already looking at the logs to see the traffic. You're logging it. Start putting rules in place to lock it down. We see a lot of people have exit point products in place and not really using them to their fullest extent. This is one easy place that you can start to use them. Okay, IFS. Now, IFS, to a lot of people, is just this dark hole. They know they should do something with it. I encourage you to not be afraid of securing the IFS. It is often sufficient to just secure the directory, and you don't have to worry about securing everything under it. And that's because in a lot of cases, those directories that contain that confidential or sensitive information is only being accessed by a handful of profiles. So again, what you typically need to do is identify the profiles needing to read or write to the directory, set the appropriate public authority, and authorize those users or groups to that directory, and you're done. And again, if you don't know what authority those users need, authority collection will tell you, and then V7R4 even goes the next mile to say who's accessing that directory. So the last few releases, IBM has made this process even easier than it was before. The other thing about IFS is that you absolutely positively do not want to share root or qsys.lib, especially with a read-write share. If you're opening up root to a read-write share, you are opening up your system to malware, because all they have to do is map a drive to that share, and they have full read-write access to your entire IBM I system. So if you learn nothing else about anything today except for this one thing, do not have a read-write share to root. Okay, so we talked about data, the need to secure data, both in your libraries as well as in directories. Here are some topics, and they didn't fall under a particular category, so I called them miscellaneous. So one of the things I find is that I think that people like to hoard things on their IBM I system. And so you want to get rid of old stuff, the inactive profiles. In your network, get rid of decommissioned servers. Don't let them stay on your system. Archive data past the retention schedule. This is something that is required by GDPR to get rid of data that is past your retention schedule that's no longer used. Same with PCI. Copies made prior to updating a database. Can't tell you the number of times over the years I've seen production files with production_old, production_x, production_1, 2. You know, it's a file that's a copy of production before some change is made. Now, I'm never going to say not to make that copy. That's a good practice. But once that change is made and you know it, you don't have to roll it back. Get rid of that production copy because it's usually not secured the same way as the actual production copy. Get rid of unused file shares, past versions of vendor products no longer in use. If it's on the system, you have to be concerned about the security aspects of it. So rather than deal with all that, just get rid of it if it's not in use. Save and restore considerations. You want to make sure that you're saving your security data often enough. If you're in a busy organization that makes a lot of changes to user profiles, or creates or deletes user profiles, or changes authorization lists, or grants private authorities, you will want to be saving your security data more than likely nightly, but at a minimum weekly. Because if you have to restore your system, you have to be able to recreate all of the things, all of those changes since your last save set data. And you know, here's one of those special authorities that you can examine and start to hone down who has these special authorities. But SafeSys should only be given to administrators and operators who are responsible for saving the system. It does not need to be given to a programmer. I think people are under the misunderstanding that they can't save anything unless they have SafeSys. But if a developer owns their own library, for example, they have sufficient authority to be able to save that to a save file. So you don't have to have SafeSys to be able to actually save an object. And again, from a save and restore perspective, you have to consider that your ability to recover from malware that's infected IBM I is really only as good as your last save. So you really want to be thinking about, are you saving the things that you need to save, and can you recover if malware invades your system either at root or in one of the directories that you have shared below root. Encryption requirements. I like to use encryption just because it's one more layer of defense. So we're seeing an increased interest in encrypting data in database files. Data in motion is a must just because you don't want passwords flowing in the clear, nor do you want your data flowing in the clear. Also disk, you want your disk to be encrypted as well. Multi-factor authentication is another thing that you might want to consider. For PCI, again, it's required at least as you enter the CDE, the cardholder environment. But it's also just best practice. And the reason I say it's best practice is because of a survey that they did of hackers a few years ago after one of the Black Hat conferences. And they said, what is the biggest hurdle that you have to get over to be able to get into somebody's system? And with, you can see with this pie chart, the worst thing to come over was encryption by 32% and multi-factor authentication 38%. So if those are the biggest two issues that hackers had to overcome when they got into somebody's network, why are we not using those two things? So that's why I've emphasized encryption and why I would ask that you consider two-factor authentication. I've mentioned it a couple times where I've alluded to it. Stay current on your OS level because many of the security enhancements are only in the last two releases. IBM is only putting out technology refreshes for v7.r4 and v7.r3, if you haven't noticed that. Also stay current with PTFs, especially for the Java and open source technologies. And more organizations are using open source on IBM I, so you want to make sure that you are staying current with those PTFs. And I'm going to mention yet again, I still see a lot of people using old client access. Client access is no longer supported by IBM. It's not that it's not just supported on Windows 10. It's not supported at all. So while it may be running on your systems, maybe if your end users are on Windows 10 and they're running just fine on old client access, there will come a day when Microsoft puts out Patch Tuesday and something will break, and you will break. All your clients will not be able to connect. And so rather than wait for that day and then have to run around and find a solution, please start putting plans in place to move to access client solutions. I just don't want to hear anybody that is broken by some Patch Tuesday that comes along. One of the examples of staying current, and one of the things that IBM has done in the SQL views in QSys2, this is a service in SysTools, is to allow us to know if we are current on our group PTFs. So this is an example of running one of those services through Run SQL scripts in Access Client Solutions, and it kindly lists out all of the group PTFs that we have on our system and shows whether or not they are current. So where do you start? If you realize that you need to be doing some things but you're not sure where to start, one of the things I would recommend that you do is you start with a risk assessment, because that will give you a prioritized list. Risk assessments are always listed out in high, medium, and low, and so you can always use that as a prioritized list to take to your management and say, these are the things we need to work on. Do you agree? Hopefully your head doesn't feel like this. Hopefully I've given you some places to start, or at least some things to investigate. But if you need more information, I've listed the information here. And with that, I will turn it over to John.
Thank you, Carol. Just wanted to spend a few moments going over some of the offerings that we have at Help Systems. Carol's mentioned an awful lot of them during the course of this presentation. In fact, I was writing notes here furiously, and she's hit most of the products and services that we offer, but I'll quickly go through them, starting in the upper right-hand corner. Carol just talked about a risk assessment. We do offer risk assessment services. And as she said, security begins with an assessment, so that's always a good place to start. You get your high, medium, and low priorities and something you can show management to decide what you want to do to improve security on your system. Then we do offer penetration testing for the IBM. We also offer penetration testing for the network through our sister company called Core Security, but we all offer it specifically for the IBM. And with that, what we're doing is validating access to data. So you might have risks that you've discovered in your risk assessment, but how do you know if those risks are really valid? Well, with penetration testing, we act like a hacker on your system and go after the data to see what we can get to, and then we actually document that and show you how we were able to get to data. We don't touch the data, but we try and see if we can get there and show you how we can get access so that you can have more in-depth information and decide, more decision support material to decide what you want to do to improve your security. Now, another thing that we offer after a risk assessment, we often have people say to us, can you give us more of a plan on how we should approach correcting these vulnerabilities? And so we do an architecture engagement, and that architecture engagement allows us to work with you hand in hand for a short period of time where we can determine a plan going forward for you to address security. We also offer remediation services. That's where if you get to the point where you've looked at all the stuff that you need to do and you're just overwhelmed and you don't have the time, we all know that all these IBM shops have resources stretched very thin. We do offer remediation services where we'll come in and work beside you to get that work done to improve the security. Then two of the managed services that we offer are managed security services, where we're paying attention to security for you so you don't have to on a regular basis. Oftentimes, a lot of these regulations want you to be paying attention to your security, checking it against your policy on a regular basis. Well, we do that for you as a managed security service on a once a month basis. We also have single sign-on managed services. Carol talked about that early on as a way to eliminate passwords. You can deploy single sign-on. We offer that as a service. It includes features and a bot for managing the EIM association table that you have to deal with when it comes to single sign-on. So that's something you might want to consider if you're looking at ways to improve security simply by just getting rid of passwords. So next slide, Carol. And here are a number of the help system software solutions. Carol talked a lot about them. Let's start with compliance reporting in the upper left-hand corner. Compliance reporting is one thing that Compliance Monitor does, but really what Compliance Monitor is a tool for forensically being able to sort through the data that you find in your audit journal. Carol talked a lot about journal receivers and saving a year's worth of information so that if you do ever get breached, you can go show auditors and whatnot what happened on the system. And Compliance Monitor is a great tool for being able to sort through all that data from the audit journal. Carol talked about Authority Broker and how you want to temporarily give people special authorities. That's privileged access management through Authority Broker. There's a self-service password reset. That's the other way you can go. If you don't want to go with SSO and eliminate passwords, there's password reset. We offer that as well. Database monitoring, user provisioning, multi-factor authentication. Carol talked about that, and native encryption. Those two on the left-hand side towards the bottom there, those are the things that discourage hackers the most from going after your systems. So as Carol said, why aren't we using them? We do offer products for multi-factor authentication, two-factor authentication, and native encryption on the IBM. We have a product called Exit Point Manager. It's listed here on the right-hand side at the top for perimeter access control. During the course of the presentation, Carol talked about using that to stop the use of service accounts and blocking unauthorized users. So that's something you should consider if you don't have that in place already. Command monitoring, automated risk audit. There's risk assessor for the IBM. That is a tool Carol talked about very early on in this presentation. If you were looking for best practices for your security system values, where do you find that? She talked about a couple of books, and it also is in the output of our risk assessor tool. So there's security event information and event management. We have a SIM agent for IBM. Most people in larger organizations, and maybe some smaller ones, have a SIM agent that covers log management across multiple different platforms. And you need a way to get that audit journal information over there. Well, that's what our SIM agent does. Native antivirus protection, antivirus for IBM. Carol mentioned the old name of the product called StandGuard Antivirus. It's now called Antivirus for IBM. But that's the tool that you can scan your IFS to make sure that it's not being a host for any viruses and malware on your system. Then she talked about Policy Minder for information security policy control, but really, Policy Minder is a great tool for managing authorization lists and user profiles and making sure that people don't have too much authority, and you can take that away and strip that away and just keep track of your user profiles. That's just two of the things that it can do very, very well. And then she did mention secure managed file transfer when she talked about encryption of data in motion. And so we have a tool called Go Anywhere that allows for secure managed file transfer. Now, one of the things we always encourage people to do, look at the very bottom, it says security scan. It's a free IBM I security snapshot. So in other words, you get a quick look, first look at your security. It's free. You can sign up for it, get a good look, and then if you have more questions, we encourage you to then consider a risk assessment, which is a much more in-depth analysis of your system, and you get a chance to speak with our security experts about what they found. So there you go, that's our solutions. Now, I think, Carol, it's time for questions and answers. Let me pop up the questions here and see if we have any. Let's see, we have one question here. So thank you very much for all the great beneficial information. In regards to getting access client solutions, do you have some good information on how to migrate from iSeries client access to client access solutions? Also, is this a big learning curve for users on how to use it?
If the users are just doing 5250 emulation, it looks very similar. So no, that should not be a big learning curve at all. There are some papers out on the website or out on the web from IBM on migration. There's the deployment manager that you want to use from IBM, but we also have a webinar that we've done, Coffee with Carol, that we've done on securely deploying access client solutions. And it's also something that we help people with as well. So, John, if you'll make note of who that was, we can get in touch with them and send them that information, as well as let them know if they need some help with that.
Okay.
But, yeah.
All right. Don't see any more questions coming in. If you do have other questions, feel free to send an email to Help Systems or get a hold of Help Systems on the web, and we'll be happy to answer those questions for you. So we're just about 2 minutes away from the top of the hour. We like to be very respectful of everyone's time. So I'm going to just simply say thank you all for spending time with us today. Thank you for being able to listen to what Carol has to present here, and sure encourage you to take a look at some of the software and services we have to offer from Help Systems. They might be a big help for you when it comes to your security and to improving your security. So thank you, everyone. I'm going to stop the recording now, and we'll call it a day. Have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.